Welcome to On Par, the podcast all about public administration based on work published in Public Administration Review. I am Jos Raadskelders, co-editor-in-chief of the journal with Catherine Willoughby, and together with our team, Hong Tao Yi, our editor, and management analyst Preston Phillips, this podcast and other affiliated outlets, we seek to A, bring you the latest information about emerging developments in governments around the world, advance theoretical and conceptual knowledge about governance and government, and connect and inform the practitioner and academic communities globally. PAR is accessible online through Wiley. Today, we are talking with three eminent scholars recently published in our Conceptualizing Public Administration section of the journal. In this section, we invite experts to present their ideas about evolving theory of public administration and its intersection with modern governing and governance. Our guests are Dr. Guy Peters, Maurice Falk Professor of American Government at the University of Pittsburgh, Dr. Jon Pierre, Research Professor in Political Science at the University of Gothenburg in Sweden, and Professor of Public Governance at the University of Melbourne, an adjunct professor at the University of Pittsburgh, and Dr. Kutsal Yesilkagit, Professor of International Governance at the University of Leiden in the Netherlands. We discuss with them their 2021 book, as well as their recent article in Public Administration Review, the May-June 2024 issue about democratic backsliding. Before we begin, can you tell us a little bit about yourself? Guy, Jon, and Kutsal. Guy, we'll start with you.
Okay, good day, everyone. As Joseph said, I'm a professor of governance at the University of Pittsburgh. I work primarily in comparative public administration, public policy, and have concentrated for the most part on Western Europe, but some on Asia, some on Latin America. Published recently 2 books on patronage appointments in politics, excuse me, in government, one in Asia and one in Latin America.
Okay, Jon.
I'm a professor emeritus at the University of Gothenburg in Sweden. I'm sadly no longer affiliated with the University of Melbourne, where the pandemic and other issues meant that I chose not to renew my contract with Melbourne. I still miss it a lot, but I'm no longer there to teach. I've been working during the past couple of decades, very often with Guy, on public administration, governance, and also done a bit of urban governance and urban politics stuff more on the side, I guess we could say.
Okay. Kutsal.
Yeah, my name is Kutsal Yesilkagit. I'm, as you said, Professor of Public Administration / International Governance at Leiden University. And let me start by saying that I feel very honored that instead of reading the books and articles of Jon and Guy, I'm now finally a co-author with them and on this podcast. And they both of them inspired me for the past decades to work on politics and administration, the relationship between elected politicians and bureaucrats in various forms at independent agencies or at ministries. And yes, and now we've come to an era where things got turned upside down in the field of public administration and the study of politics and administration. We all come from the old paradigm of Max Weber, where our biggest fear should be Beamtenherrschaft, the rule of elected civil servants vis-a-vis politicians. But now, in our recent times, we see that politicians can be as damaging for liberal democracy as we all have feared for civil servants. So, yeah, that's my main concern for now, and it consumes a lot of my energies at this moment. And again, I'm happy to be at this podcast.
Okay, excellent, colleagues. We have sent you some questions beforehand, so you could give it some thought. But rest assured that there will be ample time for all sorts of inputs that have not been planned, right? So let's begin with Guy. Guy, there was a time that many people thought liberal democracy was the end-all and be-all of political systems. Just remember Francis Fukuyama's The End of History and The Last Man in 1989, right?
Well,
Yet today we see liberal democracy being challenged by populists on the left, Maduro in Venezuela, and perhaps even more so on the right. Is liberal democracy crumbling? And if so, can you help us to understand this phenomenon?
crumbling may be too strong a word, but I certainly think threatened is a reasonable characterization. So in countries, and leaving aside Venezuela, which doesn't have exactly a sterling democratic history, but in countries like France and to some extent the Netherlands, and not to mention the United States, it certainly is under threat. So why? And that's the big question. So my argument would be sort of twofold, but 2 points are related. One is that essentially there was, as we are doing with the book with Donald Savoy, the good old days, where government seemed to be successful. Where it was able to deliver on the welfare state. It was able to develop then a system of public benefits and essentially do so successfully. That began to crumble, depending upon one's point of view, 1970s, 1980s. Some of it because of external shocks, some of it because of internal political changes, particularly the neoliberalism of folks like Reagan and Thatcher. Okay, so those good old days are gone. But it's not just the welfare state, I think, that where there's been some failure to deliver. I think there have been a lot of blunders by governments. They give the appearance somehow that it's not as successful as it should be. Some of the blunders get exaggerated in the press. They become used politically, but yet governments haven't been able to deliver. And so people, and I think the second part of the answer would be going to John Hibbing's work, a political scientist at the University of Nebraska, who's worked on Trump voters. And he argues that the major background for Trump voters is fear, essentially a loss of security. So he calls them securitarians. So they no longer feel secure about their present and certainly not about their future. And that's true economically, it's true in terms of physical safety, it's true in terms of culture, with immigration being one of the elements. So let me stop there and turn it over to my colleagues. I'm sure they have more to add.
Okay, thank you, Guy. Jon and
Uh,
Kutsal?
You won't be surprised to hear that I will agree with Guy in much of his analysis. Could I just add to the points that Guy made here by saying that I think there's a couple of other factors. I guess that if we were to look more closely at the sources of the fear that Hibbings and others have pointed out, I think there are other variables that will kick in. One of them would be gender. If we look at, for instance, the recent election in Argentina, we can see that many of the supporters of the really right-wing candidate who was successful was from young men who presumably feel alienated and not part of the political attention, and also being sort of bypassed by women who have performed better in school and at universities and who get the more attractive jobs. And meanwhile, the young men are left perhaps confined to more menial jobs. I guess race would be another similar factor that also sort of plays into this, where in the US, certainly the sort of the white wasp part of the population feels under some degree of threat from various ethnic groups, and so they will turn to support almost any candidate who says that I'm standing up for you guys. So that fear, I think, has many different sources and a lot of different forms of expression. Secondly, on the neoliberal turn, as I saw it, it was to a large extent a matter of redefining the balance between state and society. Margaret Thatcher famously wanted to unleash the market. Ronald Reagan also stated that government is often not the solution to problems, but the source of problems. So they both sought to sort of put the state back in its place, as it were, and to open up for private initiatives. And that, I think, first of all, undermined the resource base of the state. And secondly, created a philosophy among the electorate that we should not look to the state for solutions. We should look for those solutions elsewhere. We might even want to start thinking about how we can address these problems ourselves. And so there was a turn away from the state and a trust in the state. And all of that, I think, paved the way for candidates of a more extremist position to step in and become a spokesman for that constituency.
Okay, well, we might get back to that, Jon. I had some thoughts bubbling up listening to Guy and you. Kutsal, you have anything?
Yeah, and as an addition, I think also looking from our perspective of our discipline, could we have foreseen this, looking to all this from a public administration perspective as scholars? I think that the causes of the threats to liberal democracy, they lie outside of our scope, but we see the consequences. I think that the major drive towards the rise of populism from the left and right, but from the right, especially in the Western world, comes from this neoliberal turn, which has caused massive social inequalities. There's people got really rich on capital and incomes. The managerialization of private and public and public sector was huge. Enormous gaps in pay between top level managers of multinationals and capital accumulation. It sounds a bit Marxist, but people are really the 0.1% of the world, the Elon Musks of this world.
Yeah.
And so I think that drives people towards politicians who promise them a better world and simple solutions. Immigration and migrants being an lightning rod to attract attention. And the second part is we saw it in our field. We saw it and as Guy and as Jon already said, we saw it in the crumbling of the public services. We've seen hollowing out of public services. The politicians don't deliver anymore. Or there's a very interesting Italian study. One of the authors is Catherine de Vries from Bocconi. I had two other co-authors who made a very interesting study of so the correlation between the withdrawal of public services from administrative centers in Italian municipalities, like the withdrawal of the closing down of a municipality, the closing down of a public service office, a tax office, or even the withdrawal of the closing down of a local supermarket, and voting for a populist government. So this is what neoliberalism has done. It caused massive social inequalities in society and has hollowed out the public services. And these two things are, in my perspective, and I share this with you and Guy, have driven many people to the hands of populist leaders.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. I was thinking as I was listening to your commentaries that I don't think issues of democracy are outside the purview of the study of public administration. Politics and administration are two hands on the same belly, Dutch expression, freely translated, right? And I'm inclined to think that when people, what Guy addressed and Jon mentioned as well about fear, right? It's something that is very deep in our evolutionary background, the fear, the instinct for survival, right? I will get back to those animal instincts, as John Maynard Keynes called it, as well as a variety of authors since the middle of the 18th century, toward the end of my last questions, as you've seen. But one thing that baffles me about that return or that turning back the state or something, and what Margaret Thatcher said, I think, John, when people actually read The Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith, you will find that he says more about the tribes of monopoly, as he calls it, quote unquote, than he talks about the free market. And there was this wonderful little book in 1944 by Karl Polanyi, The Great Transformation, about the need of a governing system of institutional arrangement to provide boundaries around the market. But people and politicians included are not as well informed as they should be, in my view. We'll get back to that.
But can I add just a quick point there?
Yes, Guy.
We keep going back to old famous authors, but Sam Huntington in the 1970s wrote a piece on how benign will post-industrial politics be, making the argument that we have this disjuncture between problems that get increasingly complex and the ability of governments and ordinary people to handle them, which in turn then makes government seem incapable of dealing with the real problems that face us, the wicked problems that we face now of climate change, immigration, etc. So,
and Guy, I have full faith in our career civil service, because when I think back, and you've seen it in the chapter I've written for you, when you think back about the response of the career civil service in the late 19th century in Western Europe as well as North America to what I have called the triple whammy of industrialization, urbanization, and rapid population growth, is nothing short of amazing. And that capacity is still there. I firmly believe that.
Can I also just jump in? Just Guy and I have this tendency whenever we chat to just throw book references at each other. But there's one book that I think really speaks to these issues, and it was written. I think it was published sometime in the 1990s by an economic historian called John Madrick, and it's called "The Case for Big Government."
Oh, I need to check that out.
And it came out in the midst of the whole neoliberal turn during the 1990s. And the argument he makes is that one thing that we're overlooking now is that there may well be collective solutions to market problems. So there are collective solutions to market failures. And he uses the construction of canals from the big lakes in the northeastern US and Canada, the canals linking, first of all, the lakes to each other, but also then linking them to the Atlantic, thus providing a whole new sort of trade passage and a freight channel of industrial products to the rest of the world. And he said that there is nothing ideological to justify that project, but there's an immense functionality that will justify those projects. And so he said that, before we get all ideological about this, let's look at the functionality of collective actions. So I think it's a really, really fascinating book, and I keep coming back to it because it's a very compelling argument, I think.
Well, John, I will too, and I see another project looming there, Guy.
Okay.
I have the second question, folks. John, with regard to the two-party system of the United States, would you think that it exacerbates the risk that one populist individual with substantial support can override the institutional arrangements of democracy? Considering the nature of political representation in the United States, do you see bureaucracy and its career civil service as truly representing the public at the level they are appointed? And I'm asking this because, and I didn't realize this until I came to the United States, that representatives at the federal level and at the state level represent a jurisdiction that is smaller than the legislature to which they are appointed, smaller in terms of geographic scope. You see what I mean? And then when I was reading your article about the guardian state, I thought, shoot, bureaucrats are probably the only folks who actually work for the entire jurisdiction. So your thoughts on that? And I know you are not an American, but that makes your answer all the more interesting.
Oh, dear me, I'm in trouble here. My guess would be, and these are indeed guesses, my guess would be that overall, I find it probably more difficult, and I'm probably arguing against historical facts here, but I find it more difficult to, if you just look at the design of the party system, so everything else being equal, I would say that it would be more difficult for a populist leader or a populist movement to be successful compared to a multi-party system. But that would overlook a series of factors. I think that one of the things that sets the US apart from, say, certainly Western Europe, is that while the European countries are, by comparison, extremely state-centric. We turn to the state as the sort of number one problem solver. I don't think Americans do that. They will look at other factors. The overall level of trust in government is lower in the US than it is in Europe. That would also be a sort of breeding ground for populism to sort of take control. So I don't think that it would have so much to do with the number of parties or the jurisdiction, which you say, which is a really interesting observation, by the way. But I don't think that they are the main factors. I think it has more to do with the perception of the state as a leader of society and as a problem solver in society. But I'm really keen to hear what Guy has to say about this, because he would be the expert.
Well, and you could argue what I mentioned in the first question, that populism has emerged in a lot of Western democracies and in places where no one would have expected it. Sweden is another example, Jon,
Yes.
as well as Finland, the Netherlands. I mean, seriously, Guy?
Right. Well, I agree with John. Again, here we go again, agreeing with one another in principle that the two-party system should make it harder because it's winner take all.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
you have to be able to essentially create a majority to be able to win. Now, that being said, that is sort of assumes in many ways. I think, if we go back to the old voting or party literature, going even back to Anthony Downs and to people like Sartori, that the assumption was that a two-party system with first past the post voting would produce moderate parties, centrist parties. Now that assumed a population that was centrist. So what, to some extent, what's happened is that the population is perhaps no longer really centrist. Rather than being a unimodal model, there are two big modes and not much in the middle anymore. Or at least it certainly appears to be that way in terms of voting. Now, some of that's exacerbated in the US because of the primary system, because we know that party activists tend to be more extreme than does the average voter. So the parties tend to produce candidates who are more extreme, either right or left, than the average voter. So I think to some extent then, I think there's sort of two parts to the question. One, getting a populist elected. And the second is the ability of a populist, if elected, to control the system. And so the framers thought that would be taken care of by checks and balances, by Congress and by the courts. And they didn't foresee the courts becoming so politicized as they have now.
Yeah, and of course, added to this is the fact that, and Jon, correct me if I'm wrong, but in multi-party systems in Europe, and I know for sure that's the case in the Netherlands, you cannot get to high political office unless you have risen through the party. I was a member of the Labour Party in the Netherlands, pretty active when I was young. And before I left for the US, in the United States, you don't have to rise and do your grunt work in a party before people recognize your abilities and your vision. You can simply put yourself forward. And if you have the billions to back you up, right?
Well, to some extent, Macron is the exception to that, isn't he?
But I think that situation is very much changed in Europe, especially when you look at the Netherlands. And
Yeah,
I'm also a member of the Labour Party
Yeah.
for a very long time. But if you look at the current cabinet now, we've got a quite radical right government
Yeah.
with a populist
Yeah.
party in it. They have 38 chairs at the party of Geert Wilders,
seats in parliament, yeah.
and none of them is a member of the party. The only member of
Yeah,
the
I know,
party is Geert
yeah,
Wilders. So,
yeah.
and if you look at the other party, the new social contract, which is also risen out of nothing in this last summer, not a year, some ago, the party didn't exist. So I think that there is something quite changed or defunct, and political scientists working on political parties have been pointing to this for a very long time, that political parties don't perform their classic functions anymore of recruiting, socializing, and training the ones that they want to have on the ballot. And you see, so there is something also what we also need to understand also is the party system and how parties change. I think there also lies a part of the answer. And to come back to the US question, and I, of course, like you and I won't be able to say something as an expert on that, but it reminded me one thing that you said, Kai, almost a year ago, is something that I repeat quite often when I have discussions with colleagues and others on this topic. You said that liberal democracy is a game made for liberal citizens, and if the citizens are no longer liberal anymore, and when this classic Downsian centrist distribution of voters have shifted to the right, or the right center, extreme right, center right has become the median voter, then the same institutions can produce all kinds of outcomes that some liberal Democrats would not have expected.
Sounds like there is some work ahead for us PA folks, huh? But Kutsal, I have to follow up a question for you regarding Hegel, Georg Hegel, who regarded the career civil service as something of a guardian of government. When you read the relevant paragraphs in Philosophy of Right, I mean, I find the translation a little awkward, Philosophie des Rechts, which is slightly different, right? He was optimistic about the role that civil servants could play in a full-fledged democracy. You and your co-authors go a big step further than Hegel and argue in favor of establishing bureaucracy as the fourth branch of government, next to legislature, executive, and judiciary. Can you elaborate about how bureaucracy can be turned into a fourth branch? And Guy and John, you are welcome to pitch in as well, of course. But Kutsal, go ahead.
That's a good point. I think we also have to look at what Hegel wrote and the time he wrote it. One of his points about it remind me of more recent author Bernard Silberman about Cage of Reasons.
Yeah.
There he makes a distinction, compares France and Japan with the US and the United Kingdom. And US and UK being two political systems that during the 18th century already had some kind of an assembly, parliamentary assembly elections, and France and Japan not. And in the French case, Silberman wrote that probably in a time where, after the French Revolution, when the absolutist monarch was decapitated literally, and there was no parliament, and one was established, and one was really not really mature, and people didn't know what the general will was, how to articulate it, that in that time, the bureaucracy played the role of the embodiment of the general will, the general interest. So I think that looking at Hegel, one has to understand that period as well. If there is no a parliamentary assembly, when there are no elections, or the idea of participative governance in a very broad sense isn't there, the bureaucracy can be the embodiment of the general will, whatever that might be. So that I think so we have to understand Hegel's point and coming to our point. Yeah, there is also recent literature why we think that the bureaucracy should play a more prominent role as a fourth branch of government. is that we have come to see, and the public has come to see the bureaucracy since the 1980s in a very instrumentalist perspective as the managers of the majority decisions. And we all know the New Zealand experience where the ministerial departments were incorporated, and secretary generals became the CEOs. And so we come from an era, 3-4 decades, where we have started to look at bureaucracy as a really a managerial instrument. But there's also new literature, Anthony Bertilli's work, Samuel Tushnet's work. They try to point out that democracy doesn't stop at the gates of the parliament. The decisions that civil servants make, they're operationalizations of them, often abstract concepts that have been laid down in legislation, and legislation often a compromise, and it's the work of the civil service to make that more precise, and that is democracy as well, and therefore we think that maybe we made this claim about this, make the bureaucracy the fourth branch of government, maybe more difficult than it is, but is also a call towards taking bureaucracy serious as a democratic actor. They are articulating at a level more fine-grained ideas. It's like one of the images of Aberbach, Putnam and Rockman, image 3, I guess, that it's energy versus equilibrium.
Yeah, and I was thinking of image 4, the fully bureaucratic state, and the only example I could come up with is Norway in the 19th century, because it was run by civil servants, and the head of state, of course, was the Swedish king. But so it might be worthwhile to look at that case. Gentlemen, a final question for the three of you, and it is in part prompted by a commentary that both Guy and Jon made just now. Your article in par is conceptual and makes a compelling argument. However, the concept of a guardian state and the institutional arrangements to make that happen, why would we do that? Is it possible to overcome the risk of being subverted by animal instincts? And I mentioned, fear was mentioned earlier by Jon especially, and Guy. It's a deep-seated instinct in us, and we call upon survival to live. Now, John Maynard Keynes, in his 1936 huge book, writes about animal instincts, and that is what seems to drive the work of some politicians. Can we, with institutional arrangements, such as the guardian state, overcome that those animal instincts surface and find a following that is beyond belief, in my perception? Gentlemen.
Guy, do you want to go first?
Yeah, go ahead, Jon.
Thank you very much. Well, let me start relatively briefly. I don't think that the guardian state, that is the present, strong, effective, and institutional, Kutsal says, democratic, fundamentally, administrative system, can control the existence of animal instinct, or can prevent the animal instincts from manifesting themselves. What they can do is exercise control over them through implementation, through, as again Kutsal was talking about, through rulemaking, and if necessary through going back to Bremen Gates, shirking and sabotage. So I think the animal instincts are going to always be there. They're always going to be the Maduros and the Trumps and the Le Pens of the world who want to essentially profit from those animal instincts. At the same time, we can build institutions, and not only the bureaucracy as a fourth branch, but as I think Kutsal mentioned briefly, Mark Tushnet's book. He's a Harvard lawyer on the fourth branch of government, thinking about a whole variety of other more or less independent institutions within the public sector that can be used to control and constrain the animal instincts.
Right. Okay, Jon?
Well, one of the things that I think drove our thinking about the Guardian State was the observation that we couldn't come up with a single example of a constitutional system that had sort of inbuilt internal mechanisms ensuring that a populist regime emerging would be sort of accept to be constrained by constitutional rules.
Yeah.
No one. So the classic saying that, well, no one saw this coming, is truth to very, very many countries. There were certainly mechanisms in place. Checks and balances would be, one of those ideas that sort of were meant to say that, well, if one branch of government oversteps its constitutional boundaries, the other branches will sort of come in and they will sort of prevent any sort of abuse of public power. But as I guess primarily the American experience tells us, those arrangements too can be overcome. So the whole idea that there should be a political leader elected and placed in executive office that essentially violated a wide variety of constitutional rules occurs nowhere in the Constitution itself. And so we began thinking of the Guardian State as, I guess in some ways, in the same way that you would think about a fire brigade, that usually, under normal circumstances, we don't see the fire brigade. Their vehicles are sort of locked away. They're just sitting there because there is no fire. But once there is a fire, they will be on high alert, and they will come within minutes. Right. So we don't think of a Guardian State as a mechanism that is supposed to be a sort of continuous actor in the daily workings when there is a government in place that subscribes to the basic values of the liberal democracy as those values are defined in the Constitution.
Right. Thank you, Jon. Kutsal, last word?
Yeah. At one point, my response to this is also bringing up one point we haven't mentioned, but which is very central in our article, is that we also wrote an article as a reaction to the individualist perspectives on servant resilience against populism. Many studies have looked at how individual civil servants could react. So we wanted to look at from a collective, a institutionalist perspective. We want a strong civil service bureaucracy as an institution. And then comes that if I don't believe that that bureaucracy will be able to keep out populists forever from government. When populist illiberal governments are in power for a long time, democracy will be lost. But what we can hopefully do is that to make aware the bureaucracy of their collective responsibility to act as a collective actor and to buy time. And so to raise the transaction costs for illiberal governments to subvert democracy to their will, so that in the time that that they feel resistance, other other parties, other voices in society, other political parties will come up and finally have this effective counter narrative against the populist narrative.
Okay.
So civil servants are not there to save the whole world, because that would run the danger of creating a bureaucratic authoritarian state like the Turkish military state that we had before the Islamists came to power. No, it should be a collectivist effort to stall efforts from illiberal governments and creating time and space for alternative counter narratives against the populists.
Right.
And that's also a point which Barry Boatman picked up, if my reading was correct from our article.
Okay, well, gentlemen, thank you for this enlightening conversation and for your contribution to Public Administration Review and our study. And thank you to our listeners. And we're looking forward to our next time with you, when we will continue to examine the intersection of theory and practice in public administration. Do let us know how you're doing. You can email us at par.editors@gmail.com and find us on Spotify, X, and LinkedIn, and so forth. PAR is made possible by the American Society for Public Administration and our editorial team, with special thanks to podcast production person Jessica Rao, our editorial assistant. Thank you very much and have a wonderful day.